3%. That is all that is left. 3% of the water that is supposed to be sitting inside Elephant Butte Reservoir, New Mexico's largest reservoir, the primary storage tank for the entire Middle Rio Grande Basin, the place that is supposed to be holding enough water for 3 million people, is gone. Not low, not concerning, not at a seasonal ebb. 3%. Rio Grande dries up, and most people living along this river right now have no idea how bad it has already gotten. This is the fourth longest river in North America. 1,896 miles of water that starts high in the Colorado Rockies and is supposed to end at the Gulf of Mexico, passing through 3 American states, forming the entire southern border of Texas, and feeding 6 states and 2 nations along the way. It has done this for thousands of years. But here's the thing that nobody is saying out loud. In the summer of 2024, the Rio Grande ran completely dry. Not in one spot, not for a mile, but for more than 50 miles. 50 miles of cracked riverbed, cracked mud where there should have been water. A river that has carved canyons through solid rock simply stopped. And in 2025, it is getting worse. So how did the 4th longest river in North America quietly start dying? And what happens to 3 million people when it is finally gone? To understand what is happening to the Rio Grande today, you have to understand what this river actually is. Most people picture the Rio Grande as a line on a map, a border, the place where the United States ends and Mexico begins. And yes, the river forms the entire 1,254-mile southern boundary of Texas, one of the most significant international boundaries in the Western Hemisphere. But that is not what makes this river matter. What makes the Rio Grande matter is what it carries. Water. Life-sustaining, irreplaceable, mathematically finite water. And for 7 United States and Mexican states, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas, the Rio Grande is the only major river they have. It begins in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, more than 12,000 feet above sea level. Spring snowmelt feeds it every year. That snowmelt becomes the drinking water for Albuquerque, the largest city in New Mexico, home to 600,000 people. It becomes the irrigation water that grows the cotton, pecans, green chile, and onions that define the agricultural identity of the entire region. It becomes the water that flows south into Texas, then crosses the border into Mexico, where communities on the other side have been legally promised their share since 1906. That promise, made in a 1906 international treaty between the United States and Mexico, is now at the center of a water crisis that has been building for decades and is now arriving all at once. Elephant Butte Reservoir sits about 125 miles south of Albuquerque. Built between 1911 and 1916, it was the largest man-made reservoir in the world at the time of its completion. It was designed to do one thing: store the Rio Grande's water and release it on a controlled schedule to farms and cities downstream. To act as a giant bank account, depositing water when the river was high and withdrawing it in dry seasons. But the deposits have been shrinking for years, and the withdrawals never stopped. By the end of 2024, New Mexico's reservoirs within the Rio Grande Basin sat at just 13% of their total capacity. Elephant Butte dropped below 3%. And the Bureau of Reclamation's backup system, the San Juan Chama project, which pipes water in from the Colorado River Basin through a tunnel cut through the Continental Divide, hit a record low allocation in 2025 as well. The backup plan needed a backup plan. But here's what they didn't tell you about how we got here. Elephant Butte Reservoir. The name sounds imposing, solid, permanent. And when it was built in 1916, it was. The dam that created this reservoir was one of the great engineering achievements of the early 20th century. Engineers diverted the entire Rio Grande, excavated through solid rock, and erected a concrete gravity dam that stood 301 feet tall. The reservoir it created stretched for 40 miles behind it, holding up to 2.19 million acre-feet of water. To picture that, 1 acre-foot is enough to cover a football field with a foot of water. Elephant Butte at full capacity held enough water to bury the entire island of Manhattan under more than 60 feet of liquid. That was the plan. Store the water, release it slowly, make the desert bloom. And for decades, it worked. Farmers in southern New Mexico and West Texas planted cotton and onions and pecans and chile. Communities planned their futures around the reservoir's supply. Cities grew, populations expanded, and every year, the snowpack in the Colorado Rockies would melt, the Rio Grande would rise, and Elephant Butte would fill back up. Not all the way, not always, but enough. The signs of trouble started appearing in the 1990s. The reservoir began missing its refill targets. Some years, the snowpack came in lighter than expected. Other years, upstream users pulled more water than anticipated. But the trend was always there, a slow, quiet draining, like money leaving a bank account a few dollars at a time, in a way that's easy to ignore until the balance is almost zero. By 2013, Elephant Butte had dropped to roughly 3% of its capacity for the first time in modern memory. Scientists called it alarming. Engineers scrambled. Then the rains came, not enough to be normal, but enough to take the crisis off the front page. The reservoir crept back up, crisis averted. Except it wasn't averted. It was postponed. What nobody acknowledged at the time is this. The entire Rio Grande Basin was now operating on a fundamental mismatch. The amount of water being promised to farms, cities, and international agreements was significantly more than the river was reliably delivering. The math had stopped working, quietly, slowly, and completely. And no one changed the math. By the end of 2024, Elephant Butte was below 3% again. But this time, there is no sign of recovery on the horizon. But here's what they didn't tell you about what happens when a river this size actually runs dry. In the summer of 2024, if you stood on the banks of the Rio Grande between Albuquerque and Elephant Butte Reservoir, you would not see water. You would see dirt. Dry, cracked, gray-white riverbed. Cottonwood trees standing brown and dead on the banks. Tall trees that only grow near permanent water, above a channel that contained absolutely nothing. 50 miles. The Rio Grande ran completely dry for more than 50 miles. Not low, not shallow. Not a trickle you could step across. Completely gone. This is not something that is supposed to happen to a river of this size. The Rio Grande has been flowing for millions of years. It carved through the volcanic rock of New Mexico's high desert. It cut the Rio Grande Gorge, a canyon 800 feet deep, through solid basalt north of Taos. It shaped the entire geography of the American Southwest and northern Mexico. And last summer, it stopped. The science behind this is not complicated, even if the solutions are. The Rio Grande depends on snow melt. About 70% of its annual flow comes from snow in the Colorado Rockies and northern New Mexico mountains. When winters run warm and dry, the snowpack is thin. When spring comes early, the snow melts too fast and too much evaporates before it ever reaches the river channel. What should become July water becomes March vapor. Combine that with the fact that over 1.5 million acres of farmland in Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas currently hold legal rights to pull from this river. Add municipal water systems for cities including Albuquerque, El Paso, and Las Cruces. Add Mexico's legal allotment under the 1906 treaty, and you have a system that is legally obligated to deliver more water than currently exists in the river. In 2025, that gap became undeniable. the Bureau of Reclamation announced that annual water allocations to irrigation districts fed by Elephant Butte would be cut, not reduced. Cut to numbers that would force farmers to leave fields unplanted. Some districts received zero allocation. Fields that have been farmed by the same families for 4 generations are sitting empty this year. Farmers call it a catastrophe. Scientists call it a preview. But here's what they didn't tell you about who made the promises that created this impossible situation. 1906. That is the year the United States signed a treaty with Mexico promising 60,000 acre-feet of water from the Rio Grande every single year, no matter what the river actually delivered that season. 2 years later, in 1908, the legal framework for dividing this river between American states began taking shape, culminating in the Rio Grande Compact of 1938, which formally divided every drop of this river between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas before it had even finished falling from the mountains. This is the original sin of the Rio Grande crisis. At the time, these agreements made sense. The early 20th century was an era of grand engineering confidence. Americans had just built the Panama Canal. They were taming rivers across the continent with dams and diversion projects that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 was dividing that river too, also based on water measurements taken during unusually wet years that turned out to be far above the historical average. The Rio Grande Compacts had the same flaw. They were written in relatively wet decades. They divided water the river was delivering then, not what it would reliably deliver over the following century. Nobody built in a margin for prolonged drought. Nobody built in a margin for explosive population growth. And absolutely nobody built in a margin for a climate that would shift the entire baseline of what this river could produce. Today, the Rio Grande Basin holds more than 6 million people in the United States alone. On the Mexican side, Ciudad Juarez, directly across the border from El Paso, holds another 1.5 million people, all of them depending on the same river. All of them protected by legal agreements that assume a level of water flow that no longer exists. In 2023, New Mexico agreed to pay Texas $144 million to settle a lawsuit over decades of water the state allegedly failed to deliver downstream. $144 million. From one American state to another, over water. That is not a side effect of the crisis. That is the crisis showing its teeth before the worst has even arrived. The legal framework designed to bring order to the river's water has instead become a battlefield. A slow-motion legal war being fought in courtrooms and federal agencies while the reservoir empties in the desert. But here's what they didn't tell you about the engineering plan that was supposed to save us from all of this. Here is something most people living in Albuquerque do not know about their own water supply. A significant portion of it does not come from the Rio Grande at all. It comes from Colorado, specifically from the tributaries of the Colorado River on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, a completely different river basin on the other side of the Continental Divide. It gets here through a tunnel, an engineering tunnel drilled straight through one of the most rugged mountain ranges on the continent, moving water from one side of the Rockies to the other. The San Juan Chama project is one of the most audacious pieces of water infrastructure ever constructed in the American Southwest. Completed in the early 1970s, it captures water from the San Juan and Chama river systems in southwestern Colorado and tunnels it underground into northern New Mexico, where it enters the Rio Grande drainage. The entire point was to give New Mexico an additional water supply that didn't depend on the Rio Grande's declining snowmelt. A safety net, a backup plan. For decades, it worked. Cities like Albuquerque and Santa Fe drew on this imported Colorado River water to fill the gap when the Rio Grande ran short. It was the reserve tank that kept the system functional through bad drought years. But in 2025, the San Juan Chama project hit a record low allocation. Not because of mismanagement, not because of infrastructure failure, because the Colorado River, the source of this backup water, is also in crisis. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two enormous reservoirs that store Colorado River water for the entire western United States, have spent years at critically low levels. The 7 states of the Colorado River Compact are fighting over their own shrinking supply, and there is simply less water available to divert into New Mexico than at any point since the project was built. The backup plan needed a backup plan, and there isn't one. If that reality stopped you cold, every subscriber here is automatically entered in our monthly giveaway for a branded hoodie. Details are in the description. Experts at the University of New Mexico have been blunt. The state's water math no longer adds up. The primary river is failing. The emergency reserve is failing, and the demand has never been higher. But here's what they didn't tell you about the communities that are already living the consequences. There is a town in southern New Mexico called Hatch. Population about 1,700 people. Quiet, small, and by almost any measure, entirely unremarkable. Except for one thing. If you have eaten green chili anywhere in the United States, on a burger, in a stew, roasted and peeled and laid over eggs on a Sunday morning, there is a very good chance it came from the Hatch Valley. This small stretch of the Rio Grande floodplain north of El Paso grows more green chilies per acre than anywhere else on Earth. The volcanic soil, the long growing season, the high desert sun, it is a combination that produces a flavor that farmers elsewhere have been trying to replicate for decades and have never quite managed. And every single acre of it runs on Rio Grande water, delivered through the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, one of the oldest water management systems in the American West. In 2024, the Elephant Butte Irrigation District received a water allocation that was roughly half of what a normal year should deliver. Farmers faced a brutal arithmetic: plant half your fields and hope, or plant nothing and wait. Many chose to let their fields go fallow, standing empty in the summer heat while the investment of a lifetime sat idle. The farm equipment didn't run. The seasonal workers didn't come. The restaurants and gas stations and hardware stores that depend on a functioning agricultural economy watched their revenues drop. This is not a story happening to strangers somewhere far away. It is happening right now, this season, in towns that have been growing food for the American table for over 100 years. Albuquerque is navigating its own version of the same crisis. The city has invested heavily in aquifer storage and recovery systems, pumping water underground during wet years to pull back up in dry ones. Smart engineering, forward-thinking management. But that system depends on there being wet years. And there have not been many wet years lately. In 2025, the Rio Grande riverbed through the middle of New Mexico's largest city has been dry since spring. A city of 600,000 people. A dry river running through its center. The Rio Grande in Albuquerque is no longer a river. It is a reminder. But here's what they didn't tell you about the science that explains why this may not be temporary. Scientists have a term for what is happening in the American Southwest that matters more than the word drought. It is aridification. Drought is temporary. Drought means there is a dry period, and eventually the rains return, and the aquifers refill, and the reservoirs climb back toward normal. Drought is a deviation from the baseline. Aridification is a change in the baseline itself. The new normal is drier, and on the timescale of human civilization, that change is effectively permanent. The Rio Grande Basin has warmed by approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the past century. That might not sound like much, but in a desert ecosystem that is already operating at the outer edge of what vegetation and agriculture and human settlement can survive, 2 degrees reshapes everything. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation from the river's surface, from the soil, from the leaves of every plant the river supports. They mean the snowpack in Colorado melts earlier in spring, before the river channel can capture it, before the soil can absorb it, before Elephant Butte can store it. A study found that the Rio Grande's natural flow, independent of human withdrawals, independent of dams and irrigation ditches, just the basic volume of water the river would carry if nobody touched it, has declined by more than 25% since 1980. 1/4 of the river's natural water. Gone. Not taken. Not wasted. Just gone. Evaporated before it could be used by anyone. Now add on top of that a human demand that has not declined by 25%. In many years, it has increased. The Bureau of Reclamation has run models projecting Elephant Butte Reservoir's future capacity through 2050 under various climate scenarios. The results are not reassuring. Under the middle range scenario, the one most climate scientists currently consider most likely, the reservoir could reach functionally empty status within 15 to 20 years. Not 3% capacity. Empty. A hole in the New Mexico desert that used to hold water and no longer does. When that happens, the consequences downstream are not gradual. They are sudden. Farms without irrigation water do not slowly reduce production. They stop. Cities without their primary water source do not slowly cut back. They face a crisis. But here's what they didn't tell you about the international dimension of that crisis. When water runs out in the American West, the fighting starts. The Rio Grande has been the subject of interstate and international water disputes for more than 100 years. It is not a problem that was ignored. It is a problem that has been actively, continuously, expensively argued over, in federal courts, in state legislatures, in diplomatic back channels between Washington and Mexico City, for over a century. And despite all of that, the situation keeps getting worse. The Rio Grande Compact of 1938, the binding agreement between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, has been violated, disputed, reinterpreted, and litigated across multiple court cases over the past 80 years. In 2023, the most recent settlement required New Mexico to pay Texas $144 million for water delivery failures stretching back decades. That settlement took years of litigation to reach, and the underlying problem, not enough water to go around, was not resolved. It was financially compensated, for now. And then there is the international front. The 1944 Water Treaty between the United States and Mexico requires Mexico to deliver 350,000 acre-feet per year from Rio Grande tributaries to the United States, primarily from rivers in the state of Chihuahua. In recent years, Mexico has repeatedly fallen short of this obligation. Chihuahua is dealing with its own water crisis. Farmers and communities in northern Mexico have protested violently against the Mexican federal government, which they feel is diverting water they need to survive to meet international commitments. And on the American side, Texas farmers who depend on those Mexican water deliveries have been furious. Congressional delegations have demanded federal action. Diplomatic negotiations have gone nowhere. What is emerging along the Rio Grande is not just an environmental crisis. It is a slow-motion conflict between states, between nations, between legal frameworks that were built for a world that no longer exists, and populations that have no good options. The river does not care about the 1906 treaty. It does not care about the 1938 compact. It does not care about legal rights or diplomatic obligations or irrigation districts that have been farming the same land for 4 generations. It only has what it has, and what it has is shrinking. Here is where the story stands right now. Elephant Butte Reservoir is at 3% capacity. The Rio Grande ran dry for more than 50 miles in 2024. The backup water system, the project that was supposed to import water from the Colorado River when the Rio Grande fell short, is also running at record low allocation. The agriculture that has fed the American Southwest for a century is being forced off the land by the math of water that isn't there. And the legal agreements that were supposed to guarantee everyone's share of this river were written in a time when the river was a different river. This is not a story with a clean ending. There are engineers in Albuquerque who have built one of the most sophisticated urban water recycling systems in the country, treating municipal wastewater and injecting it back into the aquifer for later use. There are farmers in the Hatch Valley experimenting with drip irrigation systems that use 40% less water than traditional flood irrigation. There are water managers trying to renegotiate compact terms that reflect the reality of a warming basin rather than the optimism of 1938. These things are real. They matter. They represent exactly the kind of adaptation that the region needs. But they are not enough to close the gap between what the Rio Grande system can currently deliver and what the people who legally depend on it have been promised. The honest answer, the one that water scientists will tell you if you ask them directly, is that the Rio Grande Basin is going to look fundamentally different in 30 years than it does today. Some communities will survive through painful adaptation. Others will not. Water will flow to whoever can afford the legal battles and the infrastructure investments. And the places that cannot afford those battles, small farming towns, indigenous communities, lower-income neighborhoods at the end of the distribution lines, will be the first to go without. The Rio Grande has been flowing for millions of years. It survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and geological upheaval that remade the continent. What it may not survive is the combination of relentless human demand and a climate that no longer delivers what was promised. The river is still there, barely. The question of how much longer is still open. And if this kind of story reminds you that the unexpected can arrive without warning, grab your free disaster preparedness toolkit. The link is in the description. The river is not gone yet, but we are running out of time to decide whether we are going to save it. And right now, we haven't decided.